Good. I just want to welcome everybody this morning. We have our final week of the Dig Into Your Day with Cover Crops and Conservation webinar series. And hopefully you've been enjoying the series. Just getting ready to wrap that up before spring work really gets into full swing. It's hard to think of that right now. I'm looking out the window and it's rainy and chilly. And it sure was beautiful on Saturday with all the snow in the mountains again there briefly. The sun came out Saturday afternoon and the mountains were white and snow covered again. So it was very pretty. And then after the end of yesterday, it was pretty much gone. So spring is coming. We just want to give you a reminder, if you need CCA credits for today, please send your CCA number to Catherine Davidson. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm actually the presenter today, Heather Darby from UVM Extension, so I can introduce myself. I think many of you know me. I'm the Extension Agronomist at the University of Vermont and been doing research in cover crops and conservation really since I started here at UVM. At first really just trying to get farmers to cover crop, and now I feel like we're at a point where we're trying to stay ahead of what the farmers are doing and their innovations and also their questions as people are adopting cover crops and now really trying to get those cover crops to provide them the maximum benefit. Many of those benefits we've been hearing about throughout the webinar series, and it's just an exciting time to see so much conservation going out onto the farms and fields. So we wanted to really share or find, I guess, some presenters and researchers that have been working with cover crops and soybeans. We do here at Extension anyway get many questions related to soybeans and how to cover crop in them, what cover crops work best with them. And there really hasn't been too much or as much work in soybeans per se as there has been in crops like corn. And there definitely are some difficulties with getting cover crops established into soybeans or after soybeans. And I'm going to talk about some of those today and also talk a bit about impacts that cover crops can have on the growing soybeans as well. So hopefully we can get through that today. A reminder, if you have questions, put them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll get to those after the presentation. Perfect. All right, everyone. So let's dive into the presentation. I just wanted to talk a little bit about growing conditions where we are in case there's folks joining us from other regions. This was a graph that we put together just to show just how bad it is weather-wise in the northern part of the Northeast. And this was put together for corn silage, but I think it sort of drives home the point, something we talk about a lot in our region. I call it the kind of northern New England, northern Northeast, far northern region, whatever you want to call it. But you can see we're still, you know, the part of the United States that has very, well, less cold, but still very cold temperatures. Vermont and parts of northern New York and across the northern Midwest and plains here. So you can see that we have, you know, really one of the coldest regions trying to grow crops like corn, like soybeans, and other full season and also warm season crops that we utilize for food and for feed. So as I've mentioned, you know, time and time again, fitting another crop, like a cover crop, into this already highly condensed growing season presents many challenges. And I feel like we've done a lot of work to overcome those in corn, and we're still working on it. but we have not really worked very hard or much at all at overcoming those in soybeans. And plus, there's different challenges as well. And here's the precipitation map as well. So you can see not only are we really one of the coldest regions, we're also one of the wettest regions. And you can see how much more precipitation we get up here in northern New England compared to our counterparts in the plains, or even most of the Midwest as far as that goes. So we're wet and we're cold. And that makes it difficult to farm in general, presents many challenges, many opportunities too, I might add. But we also know that the amount of precipitation that we're receiving is increasing quite a bit. So there's nothing like a good challenge for a farmer. Everybody likes challenges and likes to work hard to overcome them. I know that my work is highly driven by different challenges that are put in front of me. So it's kind of, I guess, a little bit comical sometimes when I go other places outside of Vermont. One of the questions or things I guess people say is, oh, you farm there? That's usually the first one. And then the second one, you know, oh, you can grow soybeans there? And yes, we can actually grow soybeans in Vermont. And for those of you on the call that work with farmers that grow soybeans or are farmers that grow soybeans, you already know this. It's actually kind of a well hidden secret that not only can we grow soybeans, but we can grow really high yielding soybeans, both conventional and organic. And here's an organic field. I mean, this is way back in 2005 when I first started my job here at UVM, a beautiful soybean field in Highgate, Vermont. This is actually an organic soybean field as well. One of the things I want you to notice is that these soybeans are really in they're probably right at the start of the reproductive phase. And what I want you to notice is how dense they are. And these soybeans are planted in 30-inch rows, so very similar to corn. So the farmer can come out here and cultivate out the weeds because they're organic between the rows. But what you can really see here is full canopy closure almost. So you can see right away that it's very dark in the soybean canopy. So like I said, we do grow really good soybeans, high quality soybeans here. Just showing you some of the yields we obtained. This is actually from 2019. You can see our soybean yields generally are, for many varieties, 60 bushel and above. I would say the average probably in Vermont ranges between 40 and 60 for the most part. And these yields are very similar to other people across the country, really. All right, so where are there opportunities for cover crops when we're growing soybeans? And there certainly are opportunities. We know when we harvest soybeans, there is some residue that's left, but there's actually not a ton of residue left on the soil, and usually by the following year, most of it's gone. It's not the type of residue you see in grain corn. It does definitely breaks down faster, and there can still be a lot of bare ground at the end of the season into the winter. So it would certainly be nice to get more cover out there and get some of the other benefits of continuous crop growth throughout the season. But where do we fit these soybeans? Where do we fit cover crops into soybeans and how? And I think that's the big question. And I definitely don't want to say that I have all the answers here, but I can, again, show you what we've done and where we're headed, and hopefully get some feedback too. All right, so when are the opportunities to cover crop? And I saw there was a question in the Q&A box about planting and harvest dates, and I'm going to cover those here in a second, so you'll see some of that. So this is the soybean growth and development photo that you can find in a lot of places on the internet here, and it just shows you how a soybean develops. And so here's a VE, which is emergence of the soybean, and you can see they continue to grow and get very bushy. They go into a reproductive stage. This is R1, and they start to form flowers, and then pod formation here at R4, and they begin to form seed. They have full seed, and then they begin to mature, and then become fully mature at R8. Now with corn, we take the opportunity to actually go out into the corn really when it's in the vegetative stage, so probably right about here, and we interseed cover crops. So certainly we could do that with soybeans as well, right? We could go out with interseeder technology or broadcast and seed cover crops down before the canopy of the soybean crop closes. And that certainly is an option, and one that we have worked on a little bit. And then you can see that we could also probably continue to interseed well throughout the season, right? Because soybeans don't get as tall as corn. We don't have that same limitation as the corn being too tall to get in and interseed. So with soybeans, you know, they might get waist high. They certainly don't get so tall that you could not bring an interseeder out into the field and try to interseed. Okay, but again, I'll talk about the challenges there in a minute. As far as interseeding later into the season, that's also an option. As the plant begins to dry down here, you can see where more light would be able to penetrate to the ground and allow an emerging cover crop to start to grow. And certainly once the soybean plant is mature before harvest, you could also go out and potentially seed a cover crop. Now, can you seed a cover crop after harvest? We're going to talk about that. So again, there's lots of opportunities where we potentially could seed cover crops, but there are challenges to each one of those options. And I'm going to talk about that. All right. Oh, if I can get the, and we got a FedEx box coming in. It's awesome. Thank you. It's my soil I've been waiting for. How many people on the webinar get soil as a gift in the mail? All right. So let's talk about planting dates. So when do we plant soybeans? Now, soybeans are a little bit different than corn. They do generally prefer soil that is around 60 degrees. Okay, so traditionally, soybeans have been planted after corn. And, you know, in most cases, if you're also harvesting hay, you would plant the soybeans after first cut as well. Okay, so there is some flexibility with soybeans. We're not really trying to push to get them in May, because sometimes the ground's too cold. And we can also wait and plant soybeans really into mid-June if we want. All right, so here's some planting date data that my team has collected at UVM over the past 3 years, and we're going to repeat this study again this year. But you can see when we plant in general by early May, we maximize yields early to mid-May, or sorry, early June to mid-June. You repeat that. And this is, again, when the soil has warmed up, the soil's around 60 degrees. You put the soybean seed in the ground and it'll emerge quite quickly. Now you can see this kind of anomaly in 2018 where the soybean yields were much lower. And this was a year where we had significant drought. And so those later planted soybeans were highly impacted by very dry soil conditions. So again, generally planting soybeans in the early part of June maximizes yield. And it also helps to split up your workload in the beginning of the season. Okay. All right. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay. So planting date in soybeans also has an impact on quality. So we do know that if we plant soybeans earlier, or if we plant soybeans into the beginning part of June, we maximize test weight as well. Okay. So here's a long season soybean, long for Vermont. It's a 1.7 maturity grouping. And then here's a shorter season soybean, which is a 1.0 maturity grouping. And you can see that both of these maximize their test weight when they're planted between early June and the very first part of June. Okay, so again, planting soybeans at the very beginning of June tends to maximize both yield and quality. All right. So I've mentioned this term maturity group, and for those of you on the webinar that understand soybean maturities, this will just be a review for you. But soybeans are ranked in maturity groups that are in some ways based on their photo period sensitivity and where they're grown in the United States. So soybeans are photo period sensitive, which means flowering is triggered when the day length starts to change. And depending on where you live in the United States, that date is slightly different, and the number of daylight hours that you receive is slightly different. So in Vermont, we see maximum yields. Now this again is in Alberg, so we're a slightly warmer area. We see maximum yields, really yield and quality, in this maturity group of 1.1 to 1.5. Okay. Now there are soybeans that are below a group 1. There's actually even 000 soybeans that are very, very early. And I've had farmers up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont grow those very successfully. So they're very short season. Now, what I want you to note here is the harvest date for these different maturity groups. So the early maturity groups get harvested in September. The mid-maturity group gets harvested in October, and then the late maturity groups get harvested in November. Okay. Now, when we're talking about cover crops, let's get back to cover cropping here. If we want to get a cover crop seeded after harvest, we really need to be growing these early maturity group soybeans, right? This is just like corn. So we tell people, well, if you want to get your winter rye planted after soybean harvest or after corn harvest, you need to get the crop harvested in September, ideally. Okay, so it's the same with soybeans. Now, depending on where you live, of course, so if you live in the Champlain Valley and you're harvesting in September, you can get that cover crop on following harvest. Now, most growers in this area are really here in this 1 to 1.5 relative maturity grouping. Now, this gets our soybeans harvested generally by mid-October. And again, I say generally because it is grain. So the dry down and the ability to harvest with the combine at that time has a lot to do with the weather, the soil moisture. So if we get dry, sunny, windy conditions in October, those soybeans can dry down pretty fast and you can get out there and harvest. But obviously, sometimes if it's just wet and mucky and dreary, the ability to get out with a combine and harvest just extends through the season, okay? Now, once we're into mid-October, really going out and seeding the winter rye cover crop, you're just getting too late. So we have to have other options here. And then certainly if we're stretching harvest out into November, we have to have other options here. So very similar to corn, this we can probably work with, plant the cover crop after the harvest, For most people, there's going to be a yield decline here, but again, you're getting that cover crop in, and there's a lot of benefits to that. So you have to weigh the risk benefit. And then October, we're probably going to have to look at interseeding. And then certainly in November, we're going to have to look at interseeding as well. Okay, so this is just a similar table looking at the development stages of soybeans. I was gonna use this and go into it further, but given the time, I think I'll just keep moving along. Okay, so let's talk about interseeding into soybeans. Again, this is a practice that, I mean, if there's somebody on the call that's perfected this, that's great. I'd love to hear what you're doing, but there's a lot of challenges with interseeding soybeans. It's not that challenging to interseed them, but it's sort of what happens afterwards that is the significant challenge. So there's lots of ways to interseed. We've shown these in the corn presentations before. Here's a farm cultivating corn, but they could have just as easy be cultivating soybeans. There's a hopper on the back here that's spreading seed. And so they're seeding the cover crop on the last cultivation. And you can do this in soybeans as well. There's different tools that have been developed. Here's a retooled rotary hoe that has been developed to actually kind of scuff up the seed a bit, or scuff up the soil a bit and be seeding at the same time. You can see the seeder box up here. Okay, so there's a lot of options, again, just like in corn, to interseed the cover crop directly into the crop. There are these commercial interseeders that we've heard about for the last probably 5 years that have been developed and are being sold. And these are grain drills with row units that go between the growing rows of crop. As I mentioned before, the limitation with these in corn is that once the corn gets as tall as the toolbar here, or a little taller, you can't use these drill interseeders anymore, right? Because they'll push the corn over or snap the corn off. These are designed to basically drill seed into the ground between the growing rows of crops. And these are becoming increasingly popular, especially in corn. And so here you can see cover crop drill seeded into corn. Now there's certainly an opportunity for these in soybeans as well. And like I mentioned, soybeans, they don't grow as tall as corn. So theoretically, you could go out there, you know, probably most times during the season if you're planting on 30-inch rows and use these interseeders. I think for most people that, again, aren't familiar with soybeans, soybeans are grown in 30-inch rows like this. But often they're also drill seeded like a small grain. And so they're in very narrow rows, 7-inch rows. So that would present some challenges, obviously, for using one of these drill interseeders. So here's a picture of soybeans that we drill interseeded, and I'll talk about that more. Okay, so what are the challenges with interseeding soybeans? So it's easy to talk about the challenges. We know what the opportunities of cover crops are, but these are real challenges. So soybeans are already relatively difficult to harvest because you can see here, here's a soybean stem, and you can see the pods left on the soybean after harvest. The pods on the soybean plants can be very close to the ground. Many soybean plants or varieties have soybean pods that are just a few inches from the surface of the ground. Now, if you're cultivating, you're actually kind of putting soil up around the plant, throwing soil up around the plant to suppress weeds, which means that the soil level can be even closer to the beans. Sometimes the beans are laying right on the ground. All right, so I probably don't have to go into why these are difficult to harvest. Essentially, there are special types of bean heads that float right on top of the soil to try to capture every little bean pod on those plants, so the farmer doesn't lose yield, okay? But this also means that there's a chance of rocks and there's a chance of soil getting into the combine, damaging the combine, to get a rock stuck in there, and then also dirtying the soybeans. And if you have a market for soybeans that requires really pure white beans, this can be a pretty significant issue, okay, is getting all that soil. Not, most farmers have cabs on their tractors, but it also is really dusty. The soybeans themselves are dusty, but then getting soil mixed up in there as well can just be a real mess, all right? So now the other thing I want you to picture in here is an interseeded cover crop that has grown quite considerably once the soybean plants had started to dry down. So now, not only are you trying to harvest the soybeans very low to the ground, so you're risking getting rocks and soil in the combine, now you may also be getting cover crop in the combine, right? You may also be kind of cutting a cover crop that's trying to grow now that the plant has dried down. Now, that cover crop can stain the beans. It can cause, the beans to heat up if you don't have a way to clean them. And again, just be a real challenge. The other thing that happens, as you might imagine, is the cover crop can hold moisture down at the bottom of the plant, keeping those lower plant parts and beans from drying down. So an interseeded cover crop in soybeans can be really, really challenging because once that cover crop starts to grow, okay, as the beans are drying down, it can keep that area much more moist into the fall. It can cause the soybeans maybe to rot, and it can make it very difficult to harvest, even more difficult than it already is. So one of the things that we're looking at is what influences pod height. Is it possible to select a variety or change a management practice that can get those pods to be higher up on the plant? So maybe some of this isn't such an issue. And I've done some research on this, just searching the literature, and really in the whole scheme of things, there are no agronomic practices that will that can be kind of implemented that will cause the soybeans to produce pods higher up on the plant. And really what influences pod height more so than anything are genetics. So we've been starting to and will continue to monitor what varieties actually produce pods higher up on the plant. Okay, some plants will have pods starting at 10 inches off the ground, and again, some will have pods 3 inches off the ground. Okay, so this is very similar to a direction we're heading in corn, where now we're trying to select varieties that are both high yielding, but also better suited for conservation, for interseeding. Okay, so unfortunately, we can't change the seeding rate, but we can change the variety. So evaluating varieties for pod height might help us better implement interseeding. I mentioned this before. White mold is a real issue, and soybeans can be a real issue. And again, with that added biomass of a growing cover crop down at the base of the plant, it could increase the risk of full-blown white mold explosion, especially in some years where conditions are really wet in the fall. Again, these crops may reach physiological maturity in September, but it'll take them until October and sometimes into November to dry down enough to be able to harvest them with a combine, right? So physiological maturity is 35% moisture for most crops. The ability to harvest with a combine you know, and where most farmers want to be harvesting is below, well below 20% moisture. So how do you get that crop to go from 35 to 15% moisture is dry weather, okay, which is sometimes hard to come by in the fall. So we have done some work with interseeding soybeans, and I have done this at many different times. So I have done this at late vegetative stages, so that last cultivation. I have done it in mid, right at flowering. I have done it when the crop's leaves started to yellow, so around V7, where the crop started to grow, has started to dry down. And I would say in general, that has been very difficult. So let me tell you why. When we interseeded, let me see if I can get to a better picture so you can see this. Sorry to go back, but I want you to envision this. So these are beans that are still like right on the cusp between vegetative and reproductive stages. If you go through here with an interseeder, this is what might happen. I don't want to say it will, but this is what happened to us. With an interseeder, the interseeder parts, the coulters, basically started grabbing branches or stems, not branches, sorry, stems of the soybean. And once in a while, it would just pull them down in between the coulters and start burying entire soybean plants. And it was really difficult to get through the field. And then basically, you know, within a week after that, the whole canopy had closed, and we did get cover crops growing, but we also ruined a lot of soybeans. So if you're going to interseed soybeans, definitely you want to be doing that when the plants are still relatively small, and you're not going to risk those soybeans being dragged down by the interseeder. Now, if you're broadcasting soybean seed, again, broadcasting will work in this case, but there's very, very little light here to get those crops established. So that's a big challenge. Let me go back here. Sorry about this. What we have actually found to work best is to interseed around Labor Day. So again, this is when the plants are starting to show yellowing in their leaves, most of them, and through the end of September, right? So this is kind of the time frame here that we would be seeding cool season cereal crops. And it's also the time in which the soybeans are really starting to dry down, and hopefully the cover crop itself will not grow too much to interfere with harvest. So we want the cover crop to establish, but we don't want it to get so big that when the farmer goes out to combine, they're having an issue combining because of the cover crop, right? So here's where we've interseeded with winter rye on the 6th of September and the 22nd of September. And you can see the percent ground cover for each seeding date. All right, so we obviously get more ground cover for the 6th of September, but what I'm not entirely sure is if this is too much ground cover for the combine, okay? And really this is a determination that the farmer will need to make, okay? So one of the strategies I've started using, and I really like at this point, I'm already running out of time here, is interseeding basically at the last date that we should, or the preferred date for seeding winter rye. And for us in Vermont, that's the 3rd week of September. So we went out and interseeded the 3rd week of September, which is ideally when I would want to be planting winter rye. We did that into the soybeans. We measured the winter rye at the, a month later, and we had about 12% ground cover here at the end of October, and these beans were harvested the next day. Okay, they were harvested a little late. They were planted late this year. But I think this is a good strategy in most places that hopefully will not interfere with the soybean harvest. All right, so I want to talk about a couple other topics before I run out of time. And this is switching gears, talking about how cover crops influence the subsequent soybean crop. Okay, so we have been planting cover crops the year before, the fall before we plant soybeans. And I want to show you some results that we've gotten. So here are the different cover crops we've planted. These are planted in the beginning, end of August, beginning of September. And the reason for that is because we have a lot of annual cover crops. So you can see annual ryegrass, crimson clover, and radish. So the goal of this trial is to evaluate winter killed versus overwintering cover crops and their subsequent impact on soybean yields. All right. So here are the cover crop mixes. Here's whether they overwinter or not. And here is how much dry matter they produced in the fall. Okay, so you can see cover crops with oats and cover crops with mixtures of radish, TR, and winter rye produce the most biomass, and those with tillage radish. Okay, so they have the most biomass going into the winter. In the following spring, these are the cover crops that winter killed. So you can see all those. There's no living biomass. And then here are the cover crops that survived. Winter rye only, winter rye with hairy vetch, and winter rye with red clover and tillage radish. And you can see this biomass amount is much lower because the tillage radish is now gone. Okay. All right. So what I want you to notice is there is no impact on soybean harvest, okay, on the yields. When I compare all of these mixes, there's no difference. But one of the things that we have noticed is that overwintering cover crops seem to yield lower soybean amounts, okay, than when soybeans are planted into winter killed cover crops. Okay, now this was only significant in 1 year, 2017. But you can see here that over time, it appears, and you know, the thing about trends is they're just trends, but there were slightly lower yields in 18 and 19 when cover crops overwintered, and significant in 2017. So we've been trying to figure out why. Why does a overwintering cover crop of winter rye seem to be suppressing soybean yields? All right, so we've looked at nitrogen release. So blue here is nitrogen release of winter killed cover crops, and orange is overwintering cover crops. And this should make sense. Winter killed cover crops release their nitrogen early in the spring and winter, right? Because they've died and the plant constituents are leaking out into the soil. The overwintering cover crops have less nitrogen early in the season and then release their nitrogen later into the season, which makes sense again, right? We terminate them and they decompose during the growing season. So we wondered if this was enough nitrogen difference to give the soybeans a yield boost in those overwintering plots, okay? We're continuing to look at this. But what I think, and I'm not entirely sure, I think it might be a combination of nitrogen dynamics and maybe some microbial dynamics as well. But again, I still trying to figure this out, but I still want to share it with you. So what I want you to notice here is that winter rye, soybeans after winter rye, yielded less, significantly less, than soybeans following winter rye, red clover, and tillage radish. All right. Here is the biomass of winter rye in those mixes. 1,183, okay? This is winter rye, red clover, and tillage radish. It had the lowest biomass, okay, at time of termination, and the highest yield of soybeans. When we had just winter rye, we had more winter rye biomass and less soybean yield. We went from a little over 80 bushels down to 73 bushels approximately. So something about that winter rye biomass seems to be impacting the subsequent soybean yields. And we need to look at this more and what is actually causing that slight yield decline in soybean production. So it might be some nitrogen dynamics or maybe some other microbial dynamics as well. It's hard to say. So I'm going to finish up. I'm running out of time already. Looking at cover crop termination and soybean yields. So we've evaluated terminating these winter cover crops with tillage, with herbicide spray before planting soybeans, okay, and herbicide termination after planting soybeans, okay. So the soybeans here were planted on May 19th. So basically a couple of weeks before planting and approximately 10 days after planting, we sprayed these herbicides. And tillage occurred about same thing, about 2 weeks before planting. So we did not see any impact on soybean yield, regardless of how the cover crop was terminated in the spring. So if we tilled the cover crop, we sprayed the cover crop out before planting or after, there was no difference in soybean yields, okay? So it doesn't appear that termination strategy has an impact on the subsequent soybean yields. So we still have to figure out what's going on with winter rye and soybeans, but it doesn't appear to be related to termination. All right, but one of the things I did want to show, and I think this is useful for other crops we work with as well, is the nitrogen release of the cover crop. And you can see if we till the cover crop into the ground, the nitrogen release is more. So we get more nitrogen released, and it's also faster, right? If we spray the cover crop out after planting, so this is about a week after planting, you can see the nitrogen release of the winter rye is much less and also much slower than the pre-spray or the tillage incorporated. So again, this may not have, and obviously did not have an impact on the soybeans, but when we think about corn, this obviously would have more of an impact on a subsequent corn crop if we're trying to get nitrogen from the cover crop. All right, well, I am out of time, so I'm going to stop the webinar, and I'm wondering, let's see, we do have some questions, and let's go here. What bean maturity and planting date was one question that was asked, and I think I answered that, so I'm going to finish that one. And let's see in the chat box what we have going on. Quite a bit this morning. So let's start with, I was wondering if beans would set pods higher off the ground if the beans were no-tilled into a dense cover crop. That's a good question. I don't know. Most of the research that I have evaluated says that environment definitely impacts cover crop or pod height, but they're talking about stresses. So if it's too wet or too dry, the pod height might shift, but traditional sort of agronomic modifications to planting date or density have not made a difference, but I'm sure it's worth investigating. Whoop, whoop. Oh, thank you, Catherine. Catherine put up the quick poll. Appreciate that. If folks can answer the questions, that would be great. There's another question about interseeding in September. So we haven't had an issue with interseeding in September for us. By the time we reach the end of September, for most of our varieties, a lot of the leaves have already started to drop or drop off completely. Because in most years, we're harvesting in mid to end of October. So by the time end of September, early October rolls around, there's not a whole lot out there. So we haven't had any issues with that. And the beans aren't really dry enough either to shatter or anything like that. Yes, and another question is about the tillage radishes and soil-borne disease pressure, and I was just about ready to get into that. I did, you can see I have up on the screen, I've done a bunch of work on using brassicas like tillage radish as biofumigants to kill plant pathogens and weed seeds. And I think there's probably a real opportunity here and more work to be done in soybeans, as soybeans tend to be prone to more pests and diseases. So I concurred, Sajord, we should do some more work on this. Are there any issues with slugs because of cover crops? Aaron, I haven't seen much. I do know this is a big issue for many people in Pennsylvania and a little bit west of us. And I don't know if it's warmer conditions, but we haven't had huge, we haven't had big populations of slugs, fingers crossed, that have taken the toll on our crops yet. But I do know that that is a concern for many folks, having all that biomass there. All right, well, I know I went over and I apologize. I didn't think I'd have enough material to cover, but I obviously did. And I really want to thank everybody for attending today. Oh, we have another question. Could winter rye yield suppression be due to alleliopathy? That is a really good question. I think most folks know that winter rye, especially growing winter rye, can suppress weeds and also some pests as well. And is that what's suppressing the soybean yields? I don't think so, but it definitely is possible. And the reason I say I don't think so is because we're allowing plenty of time from termination of the cover crop to planting. And I think the alleliopathy effects dissipate rather quickly once the cover crop is terminated. And because we didn't see any difference in yields between herbicide terminated and plowed cover crops or tilled cover crops, my guess is in this situation, I don't think so. All right. Well, it was great to talk with everyone, and hopefully it gives us all food for thought about how to get some more cover crops into our soybeans. And everyone, have a great day. We'll see you on Thursday for our last webinar with Cara, and she's going to be talking about soybeans and interseeding as well. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.